This was going to be a short, but I hope sweet, video called something like Spiking the Guns with an exclamation mark, and I was just going to talk about spiking the guns in this video, which has been sponsored by Audible, but more of that later. Thing is, oh, you know how it happens, I got down a sort of research rabbit hole and I ended up reading that and then another thing, and I thought, oh, I've got a bit of footage I could use for that, and oh, that's interesting, oh, I could put that in as well. Oh, I suppose while I'm at it I could talk about that, and then, you know, it just sort of expanded a bit. So I'm going to be talking about a bit more than spiking the guns. I'm going to be talking about the war in the Baltic at the beginning of the Crimean War in 1854, and specifically the attack on the fortifications on the Åland Isles. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Spiking the guns. Now, I can remember when I was a little kid. Well, actually, here's a rosily lit me from a few years ago talking about it.
I'm at Notvik Tower, which is a Russian fort built here in Åland. And I remember from my youth hearing this expression, to spike the guns. I'd heard this said many times. When you captured the enemy guns, you would spike them and thus somehow render them useless to the enemy.
Yes, so spiking the guns, it sounds so spectacular, doesn't it? And you imagine that you're trying to put a gun absolutely out of use permanently. This isn't just a little bit inconvenient to use. Oh no, this gun is never going to fire again because you have spiked it, whatever that means. Now, in my fevered childish imagination, I came up with something which is actually not so unreasonable, which was that you might find a gun and with a bit of luck it might be loaded, but maybe it wasn't loaded. So you'd have to do the following. You'd have to put in a charge of powder and then with a rammer or something get that down to the closed end, and then stick in a ball, get that down to the other end as well, and then you got a spike, a conical or wedge-shaped thing that you chucked in and wedged under the ball so that when you detonated the charge, well, then the ball would go hurtling up the barrel and get jammed on that wedge, that cone, that spike, and then that would go absolutely nowhere. You would then really thoroughly block the barrel. No one's going to be using that gun in a hurry, and possibly the breech would overpressure and the whole thing would just explode. Yeah, that's spiking the guns, isn't it? That's rendering something completely beyond use. So that's what I thought it was. Importantly, though, I was wrong. It's something so much less spectacular than that. What you in fact did was you got a little spike that might be just a nail. Sometimes people improvised with the end of a bayonet or a spoon or something. You just got a bit of reasonably soft metal or something you could, with a spike you could jam into the touch hole, and you hammered it in. I mean, a nail that's reasonably malleable, you could hammer right in and it would flatten in, and that would be really difficult to pull out. And you could hammer the end over and hammer it down and flatten, and then you wouldn't be able to detonate the cannon because the touch hole is blocked. The rest of the cannon is absolutely fine. You haven't done anything to the rest of the cannon, but because the touch hole is blocked, bunged up, and you can't get the thing out, you can't use the cannon. I know it's not very spectacular, is it? It was quite disappointing when I found that out. When I was at the saluting battery in Valletta on Malta, where they fire the noonday gun every day, I saw this display cabinet which showed a spike and hammer for spiking the gun. And I have to admit that, you know, I'm not necessarily proud of this, but I was a little bit sceptical. It's the size of the hammer that put me off. That's not much bigger than most toffee hammers. I would have thought you would need something a little bit more substantial. Now, troops could carry spikes, particularly cavalrymen. One of the jobs of a cavalryman is if the enemy guns got overrun, you might have just a very short while to render them useless to the enemy. So carrying a few nails in a pouch might be a useful thing. And as for the hammer, I would have thought you could just use the metal plate on the end of the butt of a carbine or rifle and perhaps just whack it in that way. But anyway, somehow you bung up the hole, and that's what spiking the guns was. I know, I was disappointed, and I hope I haven't ruined it all for you too, but you know, it's knowledge, and knowledge is good.
Anyway, I say all this because that's what I think we have here. Look at these. So that looks like the end of a nail hammered in to the touch hole on the back of the cannon and then hammered over, and they've all got their touch holes blocked up. There's another one that's easy to see. We've got some fatter ones which are larger caliber with a slightly shorter barrel, and we've got some narrower ones. I just measured these at about 6 inches, and the others are 7.5, 8 inches. And so presumably these narrower ones were for the longer range shots, and then when they got closer you hit them with the fatter stuff. These guns are quite definitely Russian. They've still got the double-headed eagle on. So you see that symbol was being used before Chernobyl. Now, one thing that amazes me is that these are still here. That's a fortune in scrap metal. Why didn't the local islanders sell this off? I've just been told that they sold off a lot of the stone that was used for the Cyclopean walls in these forts. And that was used, for instance, for building one of the cathedrals in Helsinki, the big Orthodox thing.
So where was I when I was so rosily lit? Well, I was on the islands of Åland. So where are they then? Well, I'm glad you asked. They're in the middle of the Baltic, between Sweden and Finland. And are they Swedish or Finnish? One could argue both ways. Technically, they're today part of the modern national state of Finland, and the currency there is the euro, because Finland's in the eurozone. But the people who live on Åland are Swedes in the sense that they look Swedish, have Swedish surnames. They sound Swedish because they speak Swedish, and culturally they're largely Swedish. But you could say that nonetheless they are actually Finns, although they're largely autonomous. They've got their own parliament and their own flag. Åland is part of the EU, although if you are an EU citizen and you just decide you want to buy a nice holiday home there because you might want to go sailing in the summer because it's an absolute sailor's paradise, well, you can't. Well, so hang on, a free movement of capital and people. Yeah, well, the Ålanders have decided to opt out of that particular requirement of the EU. And fair play to them, say I, because they don't want their islands ruined. They don't want the place just covered in summer homes. And I'm getting a little bit off the point here. Now, why was I on Åland? Well, I was being a tourist, but I was particularly at a fort, and that was Notvik Tower. And this was a fort that was built from sometime around 1830. I've been looking at lots of sources and they disagree on exactly when they started building, but around 1830. And it got destroyed quite spectacularly in 1854 by the British. Yeah, you heard that one coming, didn't you? Right, so the rest of this video is going to be telling the story of how just that happened then. Now, we'll start the year before. In 1853, the British realised that war with Russia was coming. And seeing this war coming, they thought, right, we better get some allies, and they were allied to the French. And the French and the British made diplomatic overtures, not terribly successfully, to various other countries. The British were hoping that the Austrians and maybe the Swedes would come in the war against the Russians, but this didn't happen. Now, when do you declare war? You see, there are advantages and disadvantages for declaring too early and too late. They realised that war was coming, but they didn't want to declare war and warn the Russians too clearly and get the Russians jumpy and militarily prepared. But one of the advantages of declaring war on someone is that you could then, in those days, allow people to get booty. Because if you haven't declared war and a load of your soldiers nick a load of stuff off the people who aren't technically the enemy but they sort of are, then that's just stealing and that's wrong. Whereas if you've declared war, then it's booty and that's fine. Now, this was significant because the Navy, the Royal Navy, if you remember during the Napoleonic Wars, had done spectacularly well and had the world's best crews. They were amazing. But that was nearly 40 years ago. There'd been 40 years of mainly peace, and the crews that the Royal Navy had were not up to scratch. But they had to recruit a load of sailors for this grand fleet, which they put Sir Charles Napier himself. Ah, yes, one of the Napiers, that great dynasty of commanders that have showered themselves with glory serving their nation. Well, they put him in charge, and this is a guy with a huge track record. He fought in the War of 1812. He was getting on a bit now, but he was still considered a national hero, and people had huge faith in him. My goodness, some of the praise and expectation heaped on him by the newspapers of the time was quite extraordinary. It was a lot to live up to. But anyway, we've got Sir Charles Napier in command of the fleet, and we've given him 44 and then later 49 battleships. It'll be amazing. And he was to go to the Baltic and carry the war to the Russians. But the thing is that who were his crews? He got a load of inexperienced men and a load of guys who were experienced from back in Napoleon's day, but these guys were really old. He did not have the crews that he felt he needed, which meant that he spent the first 3 months of his campaign just not engaging the enemy, but just training everyone up, much to the annoyance of the newspapers of the day. Oh, which is another big theme about this war. Newspapers have become a really big thing by this war. And it seems that the commanders were constantly having to take into account, oh, what will the newspapers say? Now, the newspapers, of course, didn't have all the latest technology. They didn't have things being beamed to them by satellite from around the world. So their reports were often a bit late or delayed, or largely fictitious. For instance, they reported that the fall of the fortress of Bomarsund on Åland, it hadn't fallen. They said, oh, it's fallen with heavy loss on both sides. No, it hadn't. Then other newspapers would then publish articles saying that other newspaper was completely wrong. No, listen to us. And then they'd publish something else that was also wrong. But despite the fact that they were so often wrong about these things, people were reading them avidly and paying attention to them. This was a highly literate age. It's a bit like recently people have to pay attention to all the drivel that comes out on Twitter and on Facebook and so forth. Yeah, it is largely drivel. It's very often inaccurate, but people seem to think that they should be paying attention to it because what will they be saying on Twitter? Well, it was a bit like that. So the newspapers were this new thing that were full of drivel, but people felt that they had to pay attention to what the publishers were saying about how the war was going. So they were criticizing him, saying he's not doing a thing. Why hasn't he engaged the Russians? We were expecting a massive victory. Remember Nelson? He went out there and he beat the French. Although they're not the enemy this time, it's the Russians. But come on, do it again. So he was training his men. He was also trying to train up his fleet in other ways, because this was an interesting period in technology as regard to the Navy was concerned, because it was during the transition. Some of his ships would have not looked out of place during the Napoleonic Wars. They've got several decks of cannons on a big wooden galley, and the cannons themselves look pretty much the same sort of cannons that would have been used in the Napoleonic Wars, which is something I didn't quite understand, because when I was visiting that fort on Åland that day, I had it in my head that there was a massive mismatch of technologies, that the British got the latest Armstrongs and were firing from way further away than the Russians could shoot with much greater accuracy, because they had these high-tech, high-velocity, breech-loading, fast-firing, rifled, super-accurate, high-tech weapons. But in fact, no, those weapons came in slightly after the Crimean War. So this was just before that technology had come in. So the cannons were pretty much the same on the various warships involved in this action as in the Napoleonic Wars. But the ships were a bit different in that some of them were wooden galleons, just like the days of the ships of the line in the Napoleonic period. But others had iron hulls, not very many. Mostly they had wooden hulls. The first ships to get lots of iron hulls, the first ships to commonly have iron hulls were actually merchant vessels. The early iron hulls were actually more vulnerable to hits from cannon than wooden hulls, so the military took a while to convert. So most of the hulls are wooden, and he had some paddle steamers. Take this picture here, for instance. So this is one of the ships. And you can see, well, it just looks like a ship from the Napoleonic period. It's just a tall ship with sails and multiple decks of side-facing cannon. Yeah, but look, just next to it, you can see there's a little paddle steamer. Yeah, a little tugboat. So this is from a later period. And there were other ships, like this one, for instance, which was part warship it's a tall ship, and that's how it would do much of its moving around, but it's also a paddle steamer. Or this one, which you can see has a funnel on it with like a steamship, but it doesn't look like a steamship. Well, it does actually have a steam engine in it, and there is actually a little screw, a little propeller at the back for moving that along. So there were some which were screw driven propellers, there were some which were paddle driven, and there were some which were all sail driven, but all of them had sails as well. So he had a great mixture of technologies of ship. He also had a French navy to try to coordinate with, which he had no experience of before. So there was a great deal of difficulty coordinating all the new crews, the new allies, and all these new technologies, trying to get them to act as one cohesive fleet. So I think the fact that he spent 3 months mucking around, it could be forgiven, and it was probably quite prudent. But the war did have to be taken to the Russians, and one of the reasons that he set off when he did was that there was a rumour. Now, it's definitely true that it was rumoured, but interestingly, historians cannot agree on whether it was actually true or not, though they are agreed that it was true that it was rumoured, that the Russian fleet had got itself frozen in ice out of range of their protective cannons just outside Helsinki. In the fortress known as Helsing Fort, Suomenlinnan or something it's called in Finnish today. But anyway, I'll put it here. This is the name of the fort. Anyway, they were supposedly stuck in ice outside the range of that. And the consensus among historians now seems to be that this was just a rumour and it never happened. There are no other reports of lots of ice in that region at this time, so it probably was just a rumour. But anyway, that was one thing that got him to hurry up and go into the Baltic, which he did in April 1854. And that was just after war had been declared, although the fleet didn't actually hear that war had been declared for quite some days afterwards, because they had no radios. How do you carry the war to the Russians? Well, the Russians were not engaging the fleet straight away. They were keeping out of harm's way because they, I think, quite prudently feared the Royal Navy. But they did want to keep the Åland Isles because they were of strategic importance. Now, they did have other naval bases in the Baltic, at Sveaborg and Reval. Reval, as it was called then, it's now Tallinn, which is the capital of modern Estonia. But the trouble with bases like that is that they freeze over for much of the years. Åland also ices over sometimes, but it didn't freeze nearly so much or as often, so it was of strategic importance. And it's smack in the centre of the Baltic. It's pretty obvious when you look at the map that it's a strategic place to have a base. So the Russians wanted to hang on to it. But they had loads of other bases, and they were vulnerable in that they were defending quite a wide front. They were rulers over what is today Finland at that point as well. And Rear Admiral Plumridge was sent with orders to go into the eastern Baltic with a squadron of ships and see if he could attack boatyards that were building ships for the Russian Navy. Now, the Rear Admiral interpreted his orders, shall we say, with a bit of a broad brush, and decided that anything that was near the shore and made of wood that he could set fire to was fair game. So, yeah, he destroyed a lot more than just the enemy boatyards. Quite a lot of other boatyards that could have been used by the enemy, and an awful lot of warehouses, because they burn. And this was not a great move. It certainly annoyed the Swedes quite a lot. And both the British and French had been trying to get the Swedes to join in the war. And one of the things they'd offered King Oscar, or Oscar I, as he's sometimes referred to in the histories, though of course they didn't know he was Oscar I at the time, did they? He was just King Oscar to them. They said, well, how about we give you the Åland Islands back? So do you want to join in the war on our side? Because at the moment the Swedes were being neutral. Neutral. Swedish neutral in the Swedish sense, which is that they said things like, "Oh no, we would never fight for the Russians against the British. No, we would never do that. No, we're neutral," which is a bit like saying, "Yeah, persuade us. Go on." And so the Allies did try to, but King Oscar eventually asked for just too much. He wanted Åland, and he wanted a very large amount of money every month, and he wanted a large number of troops, and he asked for too much, and eventually the Allies said just no. So it looked like they were going to have to take on the Russians themselves. Now, so they couldn't use the Åland as a bargaining chip in that sense. But even so, they were investigating Åland as a potential target, as a potential landing spot. And one Captain William Hall went ahead and used his initiative, which sometimes is a good thing in an ambitious naval officer, and other times maybe not so much. Some accounts say that he did what he did because he was bored. Anyway, the British were making a lot of maps of that part of the world, taking very accurate maps, and this proved to be quite crucial. And they had with them an excellent sea captain, Captain Bartholomew Sullivan. Possibly that name rings a bell because he was the cartographer and surveyor who was aboard HMS Beagle with Charles Darwin. Yeah, it's that William Sullivan. So he was an acknowledged expert in the field, and he came up with much more accurate maps than the Russians had, and this later proved absolutely decisive. It could be that without his maps, this entire campaign would have gone quite a different way. But anyway, he was sending out ships, and they were taking soundings. Some of it, there's a story of the Russian family in St. Petersburg going out to the coast as a pleasant day trip in order to watch the British taking measurements off the coast. They watched with curiosity. No shots were fired. Anyway, so they had these maps, and Hall was able to sail into the harbour. It was Lumpar Bay, I think it's called. And he thought, I know, I'll have a crack at this big fortress there, this Bomarsund. How difficult can it be? So he let him have it. He let loose with all three of his ships, broadside after broadside. And he kept firing and he kept firing until he could fire no more, because he'd run out of ammunition. And so, what effect did he have on the fort? Well, accounts differ. If you read his account of what he achieved, he said that, if only he'd had some infantry, they could have stormed in immediately following the absolute pounding he gave the place, and they would have taken it there and then. So he reported that he gave it an absolute mauling. The Russians, on the other hand, they say that he set fire to a couple of small wooden outbuildings, and that everything else just pinged off the armour of the fort, and that they painted some black crosses on the hits on the outside, because otherwise, from a distance, you wouldn't be able to see them. So, either it was blown to smithereens or largely untouched. He may as well have been using a pea shooter. Possibly the truth lies somewhere in between these two extremes. But maybe, I think the historical consensus, I've read a lot of different sources on this, seems to be towards the Russian end, that actually fired from the sea on a flashish trajectory, things were just pinging off the armour. Now, why would that have been? Well, because the armour was really good. These forts that they'd taken many years to build had cyclopean walls on the outside. Yeah, they look like this. You see, they're hexagonal and all sorts of weird shapes of stone that tessellate in a rather cunning way together. And these are big pieces of pink, quite pretty, pink granite. And that's pretty impressive. That style of wall is called cyclopean because of the Mycenaean walls that are a bit similar, and people used to think that giants like cyclopes made them, hence cyclopean walls. Anyway, so that's why they're called cyclopean walls. So that style of really, really big stones fitted together so that they won't slide around, because a straight rectangular ashlar, they can move across each other because they're just horizontal straight lines. But this sort of thing, that's far more difficult to shift, and it's also very impressive, I think you'll agree. Now, looking actually at the design of the ruin of Notvik Tower, you'll see I took some photographs. There's a couple of my photographs, and you'll see that it seems that the arches supporting where the cannon went on the fort seem to be separate from the outer armour. And I don't think this is a coincidence. I was visiting Governor's Island, which is a little island just off the tip of Manhattan in the USA, and they had a fort there which was built in around 1811, so it was just a little bit before. And apparently this was a new sort of design at the time. And they made a feature of this. The outer wall is quite distinctly separate from the arches which support the guns. Now, if you're making a castle, you build the wall and then you put the battlement on the wall. And so if the wall is destroyed and falls down, well, the battlement falls down as well, because the wall is what holds everything else up. Everything else that you might have, balustrades, whatever, it's all fixed to the wall. But with these forts, they had arches where the guns would be placed facing outwards, and then there was a sheet, if you like, beyond that, a wall of just freestanding armour, so that it didn't matter to the overall structure if a load of that armour got destroyed. So the outer wall could be blasted away and the whole structure would still stay up and you could keep firing, in theory. I don't know if that was ever put to the test, but I think that these forts were copying that innovation of design. So the outer armour of this fort is not like a medieval castle. It's not actually the integral structure. The walls aren't what hold this up. The arches behind the walls are what hold this up. Anyway, so they had this amazing armour on the outside, and it kept them proof. Now, I suppose I should say a little bit more about my sponsor. Now, my sponsor is Audible. What is Audible? Well, how many of my videos have you seen? Okay, if you don't know, Audible is a massive online website which has on it loads and loads and loads of audiobooks. And if you go to audible.com/Lindybeige or text Lindybeige to 500 500. Then you will get details of an offer. You can get one free audiobook and a free membership of the site for 30 days. It's just a free trial period, if you like. And the audiobook, by the way, is yours to keep forever. It's yours. It's not a streaming system, a rental system. No, it's yours. You own it. But if you don't like it, you can swap it for another one. And you can edit little clips out of it to share with your friends. As I say, huge load of novels and books of all sorts to choose from. They also have Audible originals by some star players. Like I noticed that they're pushing one by Stephen Fry, and those are Audible audio recordings that are only available through Audible. And they have this theme going at the moment, which is it's a new year and a new you. And it could be that you should be taking up a new hobby, so you could get a book on that hobby, or you need inspiration for some fitness or something. Or maybe you know that you could be a new you because books are improving, so you can improve yourself with a book. And wouldn't it be good to be able to say that you've actually read War and Peace? Because War and Peace is, well, it's famous, isn't it, for being long and good, but long. And well, yes, it is. The audiobook versions of it are about 60 hours long. So you could get one of those, and that would keep you possibly entertained for 60 hours. Or if you speak Russian, 74 hours, because it takes a little bit longer to say things in Russian. Now, how long is War and Peace? Now, because I think a lot of you would be improved by being people who have managed to get through War and Peace, and maybe an audiobook is the way to do it, because you'd love to be a person who has managed to get through to the end of War and Peace. How would that not improve you? Well, it's got history, it's got drama, it's got everything. I imagine that if you're watching me, then you're probably familiar with the book The Lord of the Rings. War and Peace is as long as The Lord of the Rings plus The Return of the King again, which you might want to read for a second time because maybe you didn't quite get it all first time. So there you go. It's quite a marathon, but the audiobook is one way to achieve that marathon, and perhaps you could, do another sort of marathon whilst listening to it and achieve two goals in one. Yes, a new year and a new you. So, Leo Tolstoy could be your man. So, in order to get your free book, there are abridged versions, by the way, but that's cheating. Don't get the abridged version. Go to www.audible.com/Lindybeige or text 500 500. No, text Lindybeige to 500 500. Apparently that works particularly well if you're in the USA. Now, back to my story or history or whatever it is that I'm talking about. So there were these forts on Åland, and the Åland Isles were quite strategic, and they'd been taken over by the Russians in 1808, according to some sources, but I'm pretty sure it was 1809. I've read so many different sources that contradict on really basic facts like dates and names and places. It's a little bit frustrating, but the broad story is at least consistent. So the British decided that they didn't have the resources to attack certain other bases because they didn't have enough steam vessels with a shallow draft and the right guns, but they could perhaps crack the nut of Bomarsund, which was the fort on Åland. Now, Bomarsund was going to be a really tough nut to crack. It was going to have, and here sources vary widely in the numbers, but somewhere between 11 and 14 seemed to be the general range of how many towers it was supposed to have. It actually had 3. There was the main fort, which was sort of half moon shaped, which was also the main barracks, and it had a garrison of something like 2,300 men. And there were these 3 towers. 2 of them were the Presto or Presto, or there are other numbers too. The tower, which was to the east, which was to guard against sea attack, and to the north there was the Notvik Tower, or Notvikin Tower, or you got Finnish, you got Swedish, you got French, you got English, you got Russian, and some people translate just differently the names between these various. So there's inconsistency. But anyway, that was defending to the sea. And the whole of the landward approach to the fort was protected by just one fort, the Brännklint Tower, which was on the highland overlooking the fort. Now, the fort itself was not perhaps brilliantly well placed. It was on quite low-lying land near the sea, but they put faith in the fact that it was extremely well armoured with this pink granite Cyclopean wall, and it had 120 guns on it pointing in all directions, and they would just blow anything out of the water, wouldn't they? Well, they might have blown stuff out of the water that was designed back when it was being designed in the first place, but this sort of fort went obsolete pretty quickly, including the one on Grosvenor Island, which later got converted into a prison. Anyway, the Allies turned up and they decided, well, rather than attack it from the sea, we'll attack it mainly from the land. And they landed, accounts vary, but something like 10,000 troops. And I'd like to be able to tell you how many of each type, but I can't because the sources just don't agree or don't have enough detail. But I can say with a fair bit of confidence that considerably over half of them were French, and that the British also landed a load of Marines and naval personnel. And it fell to the naval personnel to do most of the manhandling of the guns. And I've read some quite amusing accounts of just how much effort, how much sweat, how much swearing was involved in getting these guns into position. Typically they would have a column headed by a nice band playing a nice stirring tune, and then 150 men hauling on massive ropes and complaining constantly. A big gun that was on a sled with rollers under it, and it was tipping this way and that way and getting caught on rocks all the time, and they were generally having a terrible time of it and complaining, why are we doing this anyway? Why did we land and take it from the landward side? It's ridiculous. The Navy should be just doing everything from the sea. We could blow these forts to smithereens. This is completely unnecessary. But anyway, that's the way they did it. And they attacked the landward tower on the high ground. And the operation went pretty well. The Russians did not go out of the fort to meet the Allies in the field. They stayed back in the fort, relying on the strength of their defences, which is sometimes the disadvantage of strong defences. People rely on them and thus immobilise themselves. And it's difficult to say exactly how long it took to reduce this fort, but not very long. Accounts vary, and they seem to confuse one tower for another sometimes. And the numbers of hours they say that something held out for, I think, keeps varying because people are measuring from different points. Is it from when the Allies first landed, or when they first started the attack, or first started building their counter batteries, or when the fighting first got intense, or when the first assaults were made? It's all right, very frustrating, but it didn't hold out for very long, a day or two, and the Allies were able to get pretty close to it, build their batteries, and then drag up a load of guns. The British had howitzers and 32-pounders. The French were using 18-pounders and mortars. The mortars were pretty handy at clearing the roof of snipers. At first, the Russians got the better of the musketry duel, but then the French brought up so many infantry that went the other way, and after a while, there was just a hail of musket fire pinging off the outside of this, that the people inside found it difficult to put out a hand just to wave a white handkerchief to surrender. And when the 32-pounders started finding their marks on the target, it was over pretty quickly. They blasted a hole in it. One description said that they blasted a hole that was wide enough to get a coach and horses through. Another one said it was 30 feet wide. That's about 9 meters. And I've just remembered, a weird detail. It's because of who reported it. Following the British fleet were a number of yachts crewed by the elites of Britain who had just come along to have a look. It shows you how confident they were. And one of the accounts we have was written by a nobleman who not only brought his mistress disguised as a maid. Why was she disguised as a maid? Well, because he'd also brought his wife, and I imagine that these two facts are not unrelated. Anyway, so some of the accounts that we have are written by these noblemen who had just come along in their yachts and followed the fleet just to join in the adventure and have a look. And some of the curiosity displayed by some of the captains, who really should have been busy commanding their ships and doing responsible things like that, are quite interesting too. They would sometimes leave their ship and then go ashore because they were just interested to watch the goings on, which possibly is not what a captain should do. But anyway, so there was a fight. At the first tower inland, a breach was made in the walls, and from a short distance the French charged in. And accounts talk of, as they went through the breach, there was a single Russian officer with a saber there to hold them off. And to the disappointment of a lot of the people recounting this, he got bayoneted immediately. And then the rest of the garrison surrendered pretty much immediately. The fight had gone out of them when they saw on the beginning of the second day the guns that had been brought up against them. And here's one of the big problems with this design of fort. You see, they have guns pointing in all directions. Well, that's good, isn't it? You've got just covered in guns pointing in all directions. Yeah, but with these curving walls, which are very strong, which make it very resistant to incoming fire. Yeah, but with these curving walls, it means that if the attacking enemy masses his guns in one place, makes a big redoubt there and fills it full of guns, so you've got loads of guns firing at you like that, you've only got a few guns that can fire back. And so the attacker, if he arrives with a big fleet with loads and loads of guns that he can then land on shore, can achieve overwhelming local superiority in firepower. And that's what happened here. Anyway, so the fort fell. Some while later, the fort blew up. And it's a bit of a disputed call as to why this happened. Some say that it had been deliberately blown up by the attacking French, others that it had been blown up by some British engineers, others that the Russians had blown it up. There is no absolute consensus on this, but it seems to have been perhaps an accident. That's the most popular version of events, that amongst the smouldering ruins, some embers somehow managed to make it down to the main magazine and set off the main gunpowder reserve, and that blew the whole place up. Although that is somewhat contradicted by the fact that some versions say that Sir Charles Napier got wind of the fact that it was going to be blown up and sent warning to the men in it to get out, which suggests that it wasn't an accident. But anyway, probably an accident, most historians seem to think. But you can imagine the effect of morale on the garrison of the main fort down below, seeing their main defence for the landward side just explode and be turned into rubble. And that meant that the attacking allies now had control of the high ground looking down over the fort from the land. And they were able to set up batteries that lobbed shells indirectly and quite accurately into the fort. And the people in the fort could not see exactly where these shells were coming from, didn't know what range they were coming from either, and so could hardly reply. And of course, again, the same thing, they had a few guns that could reply to the mass guns of the attackers. Indirect fire was also used by naval ships, and again, it seems to have been pretty effective. Now, the naval ships, I talked about shallow drafts. The steamships had a shallower draft. You don't have many decks of guns on a deep draft of the Napoleonic style ship. Instead, you have a shallower draft, but also, being a steamship, you can navigate your way through narrow channels, which you know about because they've been so well charted for you. And the Russians, when they sited their forts and towers, had imagined that certain approaches were impossible because you wouldn't be able to get a big gunship through the sea at that point. But tall ships are difficult to manoeuvre. You have all these sails that you've got to, if you want to turn and tack and so forth, you've got all these sails to move around. But the steamship can bring down its sails and be quite precise and careful, and has a shallower draft, and it can get into positions that the older battleships that the Russians had in mind when they were designing and siting the forts could not. And so the Allies were getting ships, say, the other side of a wood, so that it couldn't be seen from the fort, and were lobbing shells indirectly at that position where they knew the fort was, because forts don't move around, unlike ships. So ships were able to sneak into all sorts of useful positions. Another thing they could do was mass just quite some distance away, and again, just overwhelm. You can imagine if there are a lot of ships a long way away, you can get an awful lot of guns firing at you at one little point on your fort, whereas the fort only has a few guns that can reply. And so the fort definitely got the worst of it. From the first tower that went, most of the garrison made it back to the main fort. And then the British attacked Notvik, which was the second fort, whilst the French had a go at the Presto Tower across the way. They fired at it from the sea. Again, everything pinged off, pretty much like Captain Hall's experience earlier, and they then gave up and toasted their Emperor Napoleon III. Yes, that's right, the French had an emperor again, Napoleon III. Well done, France. And incidentally, the Presto Tower, I don't know if this is relevant, was commanded by a Frenchman as well. Anyway, this tower, don't forget, was a formidable thing. These towers were 60 yards across and 60 feet high, are made of this amazing granite, very, very strongly constructed, and it had 17 or 24 guns, depending on which account you read. And of course, it took many, many years to build, and the British came up and in 48 hours built a redoubt out of sandbags, and then brought up their big guns and blew it to smithereens. Some say it held out for 13 hours, but some say it held out for 3 days. I suppose that depends. I suspect that the 3 days is from the time they started building the redoubt within range of it. There would have been other guns, musketeers and so forth, exchanging fire. And on the inside, conditions were apparently pretty hellish. The corpses were piling up. They had nowhere to put them. They started to smell. This was the middle of summer. They ran out of fresh water. Don't forget that the Russians, so don't forget, I haven't said this, I forgot to say that the Russians had actually been blockaded by sea for a few months before the attacks already, so they were already low on supplies. They had no medics in there, and yes, things were getting pretty bad. And again, a massive hole was blown in it, and they surrendered. In went the British, and they were pretty appalled at what they found in there. The state of the enemy was quite pitiable. And you can imagine, of course, that the Russians might be terrified that something awful might happen at this point. But the British commander reminded them that it's governments that go to war with each other. War isn't between individuals, and you've surrendered. And tea was offered. And that was very nice, and it was reciprocated. And after a while, they were sitting down with each other, drinking more tea and cognac, and musicians from both sides made the scene as jolly as it could under the circumstances be. So it was all quite amicable, really. But anyway, so the next fort had fallen to the Allies. Now there were meant to be, as I say, up to 14 of these forts, somewhere between 11 and 14. I think the difference is that there were 3 that had been completed, the 3 that I've mentioned, and that some accounts talk about there were meant to be 11, but 11 plus 3 equals 14. I think that's the confusion. So some people say 14 were planned, but only 3 were built. And others say, there 11 more were planned, and so they thought that 11 was the number that was total. But anyway, so somewhere in the region of 11 to 14 towers there were meant to be, but there were only 3, and there wasn't a complete circuit, a complete perimeter. So this fort wasn't fighting as its original designers had intended. They were isolated towers instead. And then the main fort of Bomarsund was now on the lowland, surrounded completely by sea. The Russian fleet didn't dare try to break the blockade, and it was then being shelled like crazy from the sea and from the highland, and after a bit they just surrendered. And the commander of it was terrified that the Russians would punish him, maybe even execute him, for not having fought on until it was hopeless. And so he requested and was granted a testimonial from the attacking allies that said, oh yeah, absolutely, he fought on until it really was absolutely hopeless. He was completely surrounded, and we were pounding the living daylights out of his fort, dropping all sorts of explosives into the fort. Oh! I've just remembered. Sorry, I should have said this ages ago, but never mind. Acting ship's mate Charles Lucas is significant. Okay, remember I said that Captain Hall attacked the fort from the sea earlier and everything pinged off, the black crosses and all the rest of it. A significant thing did happen during that fight, which is that a Russian shell, a big round shell, boom, landed on the deck of one of the British ships, and Charles Lucas thought, well, that shouldn't be there, and picked it up and chucked it overboard. And just before it hit the surface of the water, boom, it exploded. Yeah, it was a high explosive shell that was presumably still smouldering when he picked it up, but perhaps, according to some accounts, he hadn't noticed this. It was possibly a not entirely conscious act of bravery. But anyway, he threw this overboard, thus saving the day, and thus becoming a significant figure in history because he was the very first man to win the Victoria Cross. Yes, Queen Victoria had said that she wanted to introduce a new medal for the highest medal for extreme bravery, and it had to be awardable to all ranks, not just officers. And He was this low-ranking guy who, admittedly perhaps inadvertently, saved the day, and he won the Victoria Cross. And this does also accentuate the lie that is that Victoria Crosses are made down by melted cannons that were captured at the siege of Sebastopol, because the siege of Sebastopol hasn't happened yet. This is the beginning of the Crimean War, so there you go. That thing's not true. But anyway, he won the VC, so well done to him. Now, zoom forward again. So, Bomarsund, the massive sort of half moon-shaped fort on Åland, has just surrendered, and they had a little surrender ceremony. Here's a picture that was published at the time, possibly quite inaccurate, but what the hell, it's something for the readers to look at. And in went the Allies to have a look around at the fort. And again, they were pretty horrified by the scenes of devastation. But actually not many people had been killed on either side. The British lost about a dozen, the French lost about 40 or so, the Russians lost, we don't know how many, significantly more, but not that many more. And it seems that most of the French casualties were actually a blue on blue, if you like. There was a friendly fire incident between two French units, which explained most of their losses. So losses on both sides were quite light. The garrison surrendered, and all the women were let go, and the guys were mainly sent away to various prison camps, some of them in Britain. There were a few Russians that ended up getting left on Åland, and it seems that the locals let these men starve to death because they hated them. I say locals. Every single historical account I've read of this has used the word Finns of them, which I think is being a little bit retrospective. It's because I don't think any of these people would have called themselves Finns at the time. They spoke Swedish, they had Swedish surnames, they were culturally Swedish. The Åland used to be part of Sweden before it got taken by the Russians in 1809, or was it 1808? I think it was 1809. I don't think they would have considered themselves Finns, but Åland today is part of the modern state of Finland, and so historians keep calling these people Finns, but I don't think they would have thought of themselves as Finns. Sorry, I've digressed again. Anyway, now one observer went in and had a look at the state of the place, and he concluded, he may have been wrong of course, let's not forget that the Russians had done as much damage to the fortifications as the Allies, because the Russians had fought from a position that was meant to have the cannons facing like that, blasting out of the embrasure, and the recoil was meant to go sideways on the wheels like that. But they had put their guns at such extreme elevations that the recoil was going into the floor on these arches, these elevated arches, and the blast was actually partly being caught on the inside of the embrasure. And he reckoned that the sheer concussion of this, the downward force and the shaking and the blast, was actually shaking apart the arches and the roofs above them. That was the conclusion he drew. Now, this does fit a few other things that I've read. Now, one thing is that the Russians did not do a lot of live firing exercises. The British were well known for it. They did a lot of it. One account says that the Russians were being issued with one shell per crew per year during peacetime to practice firing with, and the rest of the time they were just drilling without the gunpowder and the loud bangy bit. So these were not experienced at firing their cannons. So that might be one reason that they didn't make a very good job of it. And another is that a lot of accounts say that when the Russians fired, their casemates filled with thick choking smoke, which you can imagine wouldn't do wonders for your rate of fire or your accuracy. And so if you'd elevated so much that some of the blasts going forwards and up like that actually caught on the inside of your gun emplacement, that would explain why you're being filled with this disadvantageous smoke. They also found a load of barrels, and they thought, oh great, barrels, rations, right, this would be salted rations. And they opened these barrels and oh dear, no. The Russians had been reduced under their difficult circumstances to putting dead bodies in barrels with lime and just sealing them in as a way of just stopping these bodies rotting where they were and perhaps causing outbreaks of disease. Outbreak of disease. Now, the French had been suffering quite a lot from cholera. The British a bit, but the French a lot before this. And there was another outbreak of cholera at this point on the islands. And observers were not terribly surprised at the source, because they said that the French were not completely burying dead bodies, so you could see hands and feet sticking out of the ground where they'd made a botched job of it. They were slaughtering their animals actually in the camp, so there was blood in the mud and then on everyone's feet, and it just got everywhere. And that they weren't digging proper latrine pits and were just relieving themselves where they were. And anyway, cholera broke out, and the French actually ended up losing far more soldiers to cholera than they ever did in action. And after leaving Åland, they left cholera behind them as a little present, and 150 of the local Ålanders died as a result. Oops. So what was the fate of Åland after that? Well, they offered it again to the King of Sweden, because it's a bargaining chip, right? Hey, Sweden, come on in on the war. You'll love it. Look, we're beating the Russians. But the King of Sweden, yeah, he said no. He already had all the things he was needing. He probably reckoned to himself that it was a poisoned chalice, because he'd already lost it to the Russians once, and then the Russians had lost it to the Allies. It clearly was not a very defensible place, and the Russians had spent years building this massive fort on it to defend it, and even that didn't do the job. So if he took over Åland again, it would really annoy the Russians, and they would probably take it back off him as well, so probably best not to. And the Allies, they thought, well, do you know what? They thought pretty much the same. Holding Åland was going to be so difficult that it just wasn't worth it. So they got the engineers in, and they just blew the fortress to smithereens and made it totally indefensible. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my story. Lindybeige!